Think about the sort of person who would strike you as profoundly happy. Perhaps this person is confident about the direction of their life, participates in numerous successful and satisfying projects, and enjoys fulfilling social relationships. People like this immediately strike us as happy. But is that impression justified? At first glance, it would seem that the answer is obviously yes. But suppose one of the things that makes this person appear so happy is their successful and fulfilling career, or maybe the fact that their children live prosperous and virtuous lives. That is, suppose that what makes this person seem happy to us is their success and worthwhile endeavors that matter to them. Now, if that is the case, then it may actually be premature to pronounce that they are happy. Because this person, of course, is still in the midst of living their life and of pursuing these projects. So we cannot definitively say that their projects have been a success. Bad fortune of all kinds can undermine our efforts, stymie our career prospects, and bring horrible tragedy to those we love. No one can say what the future will hold, and unfortunately, any of these things are possible for even those who, at a given time, seem to be the paradigm examples of happiness and prosperity. It was for this reason that the famous Athenian statesman Solon proclaimed that we can never say whether a person has lived a happy life until we see how that life ends. Triumphs in the middle of our life might be ruined by the disastrous turns of fortune that we can suffer at the end. And this idea is commonly referred to as Solon's dictum. This video examines Aristotle's response to Solon's dictum. We will see that Aristotle is sensitive not only to the fact that our happiness can be affected by a tragic ending to life, but also to the possibility that our happiness might depend upon events that happen even after we die. Previously, Aristotle told us that happiness requires the pursuit of virtue over a complete life. So how complete must this life be? Does it extend past our death? Can we be harmed or benefited by posthumous events? This video will discuss how Aristotle answers all of these questions. The conclusion of Aristotle's function argument holds that eudaimonia is something that must be practiced over a complete life. Just as one swallow does not make a summer, neither does one day make someone blessed and happy. Eudaimonia requires persistent effort to develop a virtuous character sustained over a complete life. But this raises an important question. Just how complete must such a life be? Is it sufficient for one to develop virtue through adulthood, but then take a retirement from pursuing the good later in life? Must we continue to practice virtue into old age? Does our happiness depend on what happens after we die? What about those who suffer the misfortune of an early death? There are good reasons why Aristotle would care about all of these questions. The second half of Nicomachean Ethics Book 1 is largely concerned with whether our happiness can be affected by circumstances beyond our control. And to a great extent, we are not in control of when we die or how long we live. And we have very little to do with what happens after our death. Consequently, there is a link between Aristotle's claim that eudaimonia is pursued over a complete life and the question of whether happiness is within our control. It would seem that the more complete our life must be, the more our happiness might be subject to the capricious circumstances of luck and fortune. In addressing these points, Aristotle cites a famous statement made by the Athenian statesman Solon, who lived from 630 to 560 BC, and who is often credited with laying the framework for democracy in Athens. Aristotle asks us to consider the following question. Should we then call no one happy while they are alive, but rather, as Solon advises, wait to see the end? This statement, known as Solon's dictum, claims that we cannot evaluate whether someone lived happily until we see how their life ends. And it comes to us originally from a historical account given by the ancient Greek writer Herodotus. Herodotus tells us the story of when Solon was entertained by Croesus, the wealthy king of Lydia, which was located in what is now modern day Turkey. Croesus had his attendants show Solon all the king's wealth and riches, making sure to emphasize the things that were the greatest. After Solon had seen the king's treasures, Croesus asked Solon, "Who is the most fortunate man that you have seen?" Croesus expected Solon to say that he, in fact, was the most fortunate man that Solon had ever encountered. But Solon gave an answer that surprised and disappointed Croesus. Solon did not flatter the king. Instead, he said that the most fortunate man he had seen was Tellus the Athenian, who was merely a common citizen. The answer amazed Croesus, and he demanded that Solon explain himself. In Solon's answer, he placed particular emphasis on the way in which the life of Tellus ended. His life was prosperous by our standards, and his death was most glorious. When the Athenians were fighting their neighbors, he came to help, routed the enemy, and died very finely. Croesus, whose ego had been severely deflated, was vexed by this response and asked Solon, "Do you so much despise our happiness that you do not even make us worth as much as common men?" Solon responds that Croesus is short sighted to think that the blessings he enjoys right now are sufficient to guarantee that he will have lived a happy life. "Croesus, you ask me about human affairs. In a long span of time, it is possible to see many things that you do not want to, and to suffer them too. I set the limit of a man's life at 70 years. Out of all these days in the 70 years, not one brings anything at all like another. So, Croesus, man is entirely chance. No matter how wealthy or fortunate somebody is, no one escapes the vicissitudes of fortune. Recall Aristotle's claim that there are many turns of the wheel in human life. And in this case, Solon goes even farther. He goes as far as to say that a human life is entirely chance. This is why Solon cannot yet proclaim that Croesus is the happiest and most fortunate man he has seen. Solon tells Croesus that, "To me you seem to be very rich and to be the king of many people, but I cannot answer your question before I learn that you ended your life well. The very rich man is not more fortunate than the man who has only his daily needs, unless he chances to end his life with all well. Whoever passes through life with the most and then dies agreeably is the one who, in my opinion, O king, deserves to bear this name. It is necessary to see how the end of every affair turns out, for the god promises fortune to many people and then utterly ruins them." Solon cannot properly evaluate Croesus' life without knowing how it will end. Croesus, of course, was not pleased to hear this. He concluded that Solon was a great fool for ignoring the present good in front of him and insisting upon looking to the end of every affair. From this exchange, we get what is known as Solon's dictum. It is necessary to see how the end of every affair turns out, for the god promises fortune to many people and then utterly ruins them. The previously discussed story of Priam is a perfect example of this. Priam also lived well for most of his life. He was wise, virtuous, and powerful. However, his life came to a tragic end for both himself and his son Hector. Would we really say, given this ending, that Priam lived a blessed and happy life? It is important to recognize the implications of accepting Solon's dictum. If we say that we cannot evaluate whether a person has lived well or lived happily until their life ends, then we cannot now say of any living person that he or she is happy. We simply do not have enough information to make that assessment. After all, things may be going well for them now, but for all we know, things may take a very serious turn for the worse at the end. This line of thinking may also suggest that evaluating whether someone lived a happy life depends upon what happens after they die. A person who lives a fulfilled life will have many projects that they take seriously and care deeply about. However, in some cases, the success of a given endeavor may not occur until after the person has died. Ensuring the well being of our children is one example, but there are others as well. Achieving literary or musical fame, or fighting for a more just and fair society. There are plenty of examples of famous artists, musicians, authors, and philosophers whose work was only appreciated after their death. In addition, many social reformers never lived to see the changes that they so ardently advocated for and fought for become a reality during their lifetime. So we are left with the following question: how long must we wait until we can say that someone has lived a happy life? When can we finally safely pronounce that a person has achieved eudaimonia? We have seen the origin of Solon's dictum as well as the motivations behind it. But is the claim that it makes really true? Do we really need to wait until someone has died to evaluate their happiness? Aristotle considers two reasons in favor of Solon's dictum. First, perhaps the reason we cannot know whether someone is happy until they have died is because only a dead person can be happy. On this view, happiness is something only enjoyed by the dead. It is something that the living are always striving for but can never fully attain. However, Aristotle finds this view to be problematic. Recall that in Aristotle's view, happiness is a kind of activity. Specifically, it is the continual activity of controlling our appetites and desires through reason, the continual pursuit of a virtuous character over a complete life. The happy person is not idle or inactive. The happy person takes active steps toward developing the habits of virtue. Of course, the person who has died can no longer do this, and consequently, it strikes Aristotle as ridiculous to say that only the dead can be happy. Perhaps then there is a different justification for Solon's dictum. Maybe the idea is not that only the dead can be happy, but maybe the point is that while the dead themselves are neither happy nor unhappy, it is only after a person has died, only after their life has ended, that we can be in a position to judge whether they lived well. This answer does have a strong intuitive pull. After all, Solon is right that human life is subject to many changes of fortune, and it does seem that the way in which a person's life ends has a significant effect on the story we tell about that person. Although Priam lived well for the majority of his life, doesn't the way his life ended make the story of his life tragic? When we evaluate a person's life, we are not only concerned with the total amount of good things that that life contains. We also seem to be concerned with the overall shape and distribution of the goodness within that person's life. For example, those whose lives start out poorly but end triumphantly are considered heroes who overcame great obstacles. On the other hand, those whose lives began well but ended tragically are seen as the objects of pity. We seem to think it preferable that a life begin badly but end well, instead of beginning well and ending poorly. And this seems to be the case even if the total amount of happiness or pleasure or good things in each life was exactly equal. So, as Aristotle suggests, perhaps it is only once someone has died when we can see the full story of their life, and when they are finally beyond the reach of evils and misfortunes, that we can finally say that they have lived either happily or they have lived poorly. As intuitive as this idea may be to us, Aristotle points out that it is still open to dispute. Specifically, Aristotle expresses hesitation about the claim that the dead are now beyond the reach of evils and misfortunes. Aristotle argues here that there may be some reason to think our happiness can be influenced by events that occur even after we have died. We will call this argument the argument from unknown benefits and harms. And the argument reads as follows. Premise 1. If someone who is alive can be benefited or harmed by something she is unaware of, then someone who is dead can also be benefited or harmed by something that she is unaware of. Premise 2. Someone who is alive can be benefited or harmed by something they are unaware of. Therefore, the conclusion that is drawn is that someone who is dead can be benefited or harmed by something that they are unaware of. The basis of this argument is that some things can be good for us or bad for us even if we do not know about them. The first premise establishes a symmetry between the unknown harms and benefits that are suffered and enjoyed by the living and those suffered and enjoyed by the dead. If it is possible that those who are living can be harmed or benefited by things they do not know about, then the same should also be true of the dead. As Aristotle puts it, good and evil are thought to happen to a dead person, since they can happen to a person who is alive but not aware of them. From this symmetry, the argument draws the conclusion that there are things that can happen to us after we die that can influence our happiness. As examples, Aristotle cites honors and dishonors and the good and bad fortunes of his children or his descendants generally. The person who is praised and honored after their death for their accomplishments is benefited, even though on account of being dead, they will not know anything about it. Furthermore, if a person's children end up experiencing tragedy after the parent has died, then the parent's happiness is diminished despite the fact that the parent is completely unaware of any of this. This may seem like a strange claim, but ultimately it is based on the idea that the happiness of parents is uniquely tied to the happiness and well-being of their children. Shouldn't we say that the tragedies a child suffers are unfortunate not only for the child, but for the parents as well? Don't such tragedies undermine the parent's hope that the child will live well? Isn't parental love and affection based on a deep desire that the child flourishes over the entire course of her life? If these things are so, then why should it matter that the events which diminish the child's flourishing happen only after the parent has already died? However, in order to draw this conclusion, an additional claim is still needed. And that brings us to the second premise. Given that there is this symmetry between the living and the dead, the question we need to ask is, can someone who is alive be benefited or harmed by something she does not know about and is unaware of? If the answer is no, then the aforementioned symmetry really will not matter. The basic premise of the argument is that death does not prevent us from being benefited and harmed, precisely because even those who are alive can be benefited and harmed by things they know nothing about. So we need to ask, is unknown harm and benefit possible for the living? Can we think of any examples of this? The contemporary philosopher Thomas Nagel addresses this exact point. He notes that it is common to think that what you don't know can't hurt you. But should we accept this? What would the implications of this be? Would those be implications we would be willing to accept as true? Nagel explains that if we accept this common idea, it would mean that even if a man is betrayed by his friends, ridiculed behind his back, and despised by people who treat him politely to his face, none of it can be counted as a misfortune for him so long as he does not suffer as a result. Imagine someone who is constantly ridiculed, criticized, and made fun of by people who, when in person, claim to be his friends. Suppose he never finds out about this betrayal. Should we say because he never finds out about it that this betrayal doesn't really do him any harm? Isn't the more intuitive response to say that this person is harmed by the betrayal of their false friends, but just never happens to find out about it? Would you want to live a life where the goodwill of those who you thought were your close friends turned out to be a lie? Is it really enough to merely believe that we have fulfilling social relationships? Doesn't it also matter what is actually true about those relationships? Likewise, Nagel also points to examples of how someone might be harmed after their death. If we really think that we cannot be harmed by what we are not aware of, then that would mean a man is not injured if his wishes are ignored by the executor of his will, or if after his death the belief becomes current that all the literary works on which his fame rests were really written by his brother, who, as a matter of fact, died in Mexico at the age of 28. But none of these claims really seem plausible. We may not know anything about the damage our reputation could suffer after we die, but that doesn't mean our happiness and well being wouldn't be affected if our reputation was tarnished by false beliefs and spurious accusations after our death. Wouldn't you hope that your reputation was not ruined in this way? Doesn't that suggest that this would constitute a legitimate harm to you? As Aquinas points out in his commentary, the primary differentiating feature between the living and the dead is the loss of consciousness. It is this loss of consciousness that prevents the dead from being aware of what may happen to their children, their descendants, or their reputation. However, the living who are fully conscious can also be ignorant and unaware of the ways in which they are being harmed for a variety of reasons. It could be a lack of information, it could be willful blindness, it could be a conspiracy by other people to confuse us about reality. Yet, while it is true that the reason the dead lack awareness is different than the reasons that the living might lack awareness, it is still the case that both the living and the dead can be similarly ignorant about what is happening to them. Maybe there are some things we would rather be ignorant about. But as a general rule, ignorance about the bad things that happen to us does not really make us happy. Ignorance, in the end, ultimately is not bliss. Ignorance of the ways in which we are suffering only succeeds in making us an object of pity. If that is true, then perhaps Solon's dictum did not really go far enough. Perhaps we need to wait not only until a person has died, but also sometime after that, to evaluate whether they lived a happy life. Maybe we need to wait and see what happens to their children, surviving friends, descendants, and reputation until we can really know whether a person has lived well. So, where does all of this leave us? We have seen that we need an answer to the question of whether the dead can be benefited and harmed. However, we've also seen that there are problems with both ways that you can answer this question. Suppose we say that yes, it is possible for the dead to be benefited and harmed. Despite the reasons we have mentioned in favor of this position, Aristotle also notices a problem with this view. He tells us that though a person may live a blessed life into his old age and may have died accordingly, many reverses may happen in connection with his descendants. Some of them may be good and meet with the life they deserve, others the contrary, and clearly the relation to the ancestors can vary to any degree. It would indeed be odd if the dead person also were to share in these vicissitudes, and be sometimes happy, sometimes wretched. We should recall that happiness is supposed to be something permanent and lasting. But if that is the case, then how can the happiness of the dead be tied to the fortunes and misfortunes of their children and descendants? Are we to say, as the fortunes of our descendants change, that we are variously happy and miserable? That we are sometimes happy, sometimes wretched? If this were the case, then happiness couldn't be something permanent and largely within our control. As Aristotle puts it, it would be odd if the dead person also were to share in all these vicissitudes. In his commentary, Aquinas further supports this point with the following observation. Indeed, it does happen that children are quite different from their parents. Good parents have wicked children, and wealthy parents needy children. From this statement, something unfitting seems to follow for both parents and children. Nobody denies that parents have a profound influence on their children. However, not even the best efforts of a parent can guarantee that a child will not go astray. There are plenty of examples of morally good parents with morally bad children. Again, it would seem odd to think that the virtue of the parents is undermined by the vice of the children or vice versa, especially once the parent has already died. So there is something unfitting in the idea that the fortunes and misfortunes of one's children can have posthumous effects on their parents' happiness. Yet the other way of answering this question has its own problematic aspects. Suppose we instead say that no, it is not possible for the dead to be benefited and harmed. This would mean that no matter how poorly things go for our children, or no matter how much people slander us and destroy our reputation, once we die, there's nothing that can happen that can make any difference to our happiness. But does this position make sense of the fact that the fortunes of our descendants and children matter deeply to us? If we care deeply about the well being of our children and recognize that the success or failure of this goal will depend on what happens after we die, then how can we be indifferent to how the lives of our children will go after we are gone? Having a child connects us to the future and to future generations of humanity in a way that makes it natural and rational to care about what happens after we die. The same can be said of the individual who strives for literary, artistic, or musical fame. Shouldn't the way in which her work is received and perceived by posterity be important to her? What about the individual who fights for the cause of justice during her life? Would it make sense to think that the ultimate success of that cause would stop being important to her just because she has died? If these projects are worth spending our lives pursuing, then how can their ultimate success not be something that is important to us? For this reason, Aristotle states that it would also be odd if the fortunes of descendants had no effect on their ancestors for any time at all. In fact, Aristotle tells us that the idea that the fortunes of a person's descendants and all his friends have no effect on him seems excessively heartless. If the good human life requires deep human connection, then it seems like the person who lives well must hope that her family, children, and friends prosper, not only while she lives, but even after she has passed away. Wouldn't it indeed be heartless for a person to think otherwise? There is much more to say on this point, more than I can say in the present video. However, for a more complete discussion of this topic, see the supplemental lecture entitled Aristotle, Posthumous Harm, and Categorical Desires that is linked in the description of this video. Now, all of this leaves us in a difficult position. Either way we answer the question about harm and benefit to the dead seems to have problems. Thus, there seems to be a real puzzle about death and happiness. How should that puzzle be resolved? Ultimately, Aristotle resolves this dilemma by taking an intermediate position. He rejects the idea that what happens after our death doesn't affect us in any way. It is possible for the dead to be benefited and harmed by what happens to their descendants or reputation. But the critical point is that such harm is not significant enough to undermine a person's happiness. Aristotle tells us that whatever harm the dead might experience, it must at least be of such an extent and kind as to not make happy those who are not happy already, nor to deprive those who are happy of their being blessed. So when friends do well, and likewise when they do badly, it does seem to have some effect on the dead. But it is of such a nature and a degree as neither to make not happy those who are happy, nor anything like that. To see this point, imagine a person who lived an exemplary life. She was virtuous, successful, made effective use of the external goods she was fortunate enough to have, and had fulfilling relationships with family and friends. Aristotle's point is that there is nothing that can happen once this person dies that can make it wrong to say that she lived a happy life. Still, happiness itself is not quite an all or nothing matter. A person can be virtuous and thus technically happy, but not blessed because of the various misfortunes that she suffers. If this is true while we are alive, then presumably it should also be true while we are dead. If the virtuous and happy person's children undergo serious hardship after she has died, then that does take away from her blessedness to some extent. It does, to some degree, make her life less enviable and less worthy of choice than it otherwise would have been. Still, these things cannot undermine the fact that she lived virtuously and consequently cannot take away the fact that she lived a happy life. It makes sense that Aristotle would take this position given his criteria for eudaimonia that we identified previously. Recall that one of his criteria for eudaimonia is that it must be something largely within our control. Now, this does not mean entirely within our control. There may be some very extreme unlucky circumstances that could unfortunately prevent us from living a happy life. In particular, circumstances that would prevent a person from living virtuously or living an authentically human life. However, if a person has successfully achieved happiness through virtue, then this would imply that this person has achieved something that bad luck simply cannot take away. As such, it makes sense that Aristotle would think that events after our death can only have a minimal effect on our happiness. We should emphasize that this is good news for us as we strive to live a happy and virtuous life. Life will have many turns of the wheel, as Aristotle puts it, and many difficulties that we simply cannot predict. But the happy life is always within our grasp if we apply ourselves properly and strive after what is good. In Aristotle's view, we can rejoice at the fact that what is most important in life cannot be taken away from us.